My name is Melissa Grant. I'm 32 years old, and the moment I walked into my brother's wedding by the lake, I knew I wasn't supposed to be there. Not really. Everything about the place was carefully arranged to send a message: the guests, the decor, the quiet confidence in the way people spoke to each other. I stepped onto the deck in a simple dress, no designer labels, no effort to blend in, and that was enough. I heard it before I saw her. The bride leaned in close to someone beside her, her voice low but deliberate, sharp enough to travel. She made a comment about me, about where I came from, about how some people never quite fit the picture, and the soft laughter that followed told me she thought I wouldn't notice. I didn't turn around. I didn't react. I didn't give her the satisfaction. Silence has a way of unsettling people who expect shame. As I moved further inside, a member of the venue, staff caught sight of me and stopped mid-step, recognition flashing across his face. He started to speak, then hesitated. I gave a small shake of my head and he said nothing. My phone buzzed in my hand right then. A name appeared on the screen, one I wasn't ready to deal with yet, so I let it ring. I hadn't come to cause trouble. I hadn't come to explain myself. But standing there, listening to the way people talked when they thought I was invisible, I realized something important. I wasn't just attending a wedding. I was watching people make assumptions that were about to matter. And before this day was over, pretending I was just the quiet sister from a small town was no longer going to be an option. If you're drawn to stories where hidden truths quietly change everything, take a moment to subscribe and share where you're watching from. Then stay with me, because what happened next at that wedding is something none of them saw coming. The water behind the venue barely moved, smooth and quiet, and that stillness pulled my thoughts back to a pattern I had known most of my life. In my family, attention had a clear direction, and it rarely landed on me. Decisions were shaped around my brother from the beginning, his plans discussed openly, his preferences considered practical, reasonable, worth adjusting for, while my presence felt secondary, like something assumed rather than chosen. It wasn't that anyone was openly cruel or deliberately dismissive. That would have been easier to recognize. Instead, it was subtle and consistent. Conversations shifted away when I spoke too long. Questions meant for both of us were answered before I had a chance to respond. Praise was given where it was expected, and silence filled the rest. Over time, I understood what was rewarded and what was ignored, and I learned to stay within the boundaries that kept things smooth. I became easy, agreeable, low maintenance, the person no one worried about because no one had to. As a child, I told myself this was normal, that families naturally lean on the loudest voice, the clearest ambition, the person who seemed most certain of where they were going. As I got older, I realized certainty wasn't the difference. Permission was. My brother was allowed to take up space. I wasn't. By the time adulthood arrived, the roles were set. Expectations for him came with confidence and support. Expectations for me came with silence. When I started making choices that didn't align neatly with the life they imagined, there were no arguments, no warnings, no attempts to redirect me. There was simply a lack of interest, as if my path existed somewhere just outside the frame of what mattered. Leaving home didn't feel dramatic because nothing was holding me there. I didn't leave in anger or disappointment. I left because staying meant continuing to shrink in a space that had already decided who mattered most. Distance made everything easier. Calls became brief and polite. Updates were exchanged without curiosity. No one pressed for details, and I stopped offering them. It wasn't secrecy or resentment. It was practicality. You don't explain yourself to people who never asked for your opinion to begin with. Standing there at the wedding, surrounded by voices that carried the same confident assumptions I'd grown up with, the familiarity of it all was impossible to ignore. The way people spoke around me, certain of their importance, comfortable in their roles, reminded me that this dynamic hadn't started today. It had simply followed me here. I had spent years building a life that didn't require validation from anyone in that family, And yet, the moment I stepped back into their world, the old rules resurfaced without hesitation. I wasn't expected to contribute. I wasn't expected to be heard. I was expected to exist quietly on the edge of the picture. Watching the ceremony area from a distance, listening to the hum of conversation and laughter drifting across the lake, it became clear that this wedding wasn't the beginning of anything new for me. It was a continuation of something I had lived with for so long that I almost forgot it had shaped me. And for the first time in years, I could feel how thin the line was between choosing silence out of habit and refusing it because it no longer fit. From where I stood, it was easy to watch without being noticed, and that's when I began paying closer attention to the bride's family. They moved through the reception with a confidence that felt practiced, stopping just long enough with each group to leave an impression, then moving on before any real questions could form. Their conversations didn't sound like wedding small talk. They weren't asking where people were from or how they knew the couple. They were exchanging information measured and deliberate, referencing relationships instead of introductions and outcomes instead of possibilities. I heard mentions of partners being already aligned, of projects that were cleared on the back end, of timelines spoken about as if approval was a formality rather than a process. The language was subtle, but it was precise, the kind used by people who understand internal structures and assume the room will follow their lead. What stood out most was the certainty. There was no hesitation, no conditional phrasing, no sense that anything could shift unexpectedly. They spoke like people who believed control was already secured. As I listened, certain phrases caught my attention, not because they were impressive, but because they were familiar. They referenced frameworks and operational terms that didn't exist outside closed meetings and internal documents. These weren't buzzwords meant to sound important. They were markers, signals that suggested access most people at a wedding wouldn't have. One conversation drifted toward a discussion of an upcoming transition described casually, confidently, with a timeline that felt uncomfortably specific. Another touched on a delayed approval dismissed as a temporary obstacle already accounted for. A comment about restructuring landed too cleanly, too precisely, as if the details were already known rather than speculated. Individually, none of it meant much. Together, it formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. The more I listened, the clearer it became that their confidence wasn't social. It was strategic. They weren't just enjoying the attention of the day, they were operating from a position they believed was protected. That belief unsettled me. It suggested influence that hadn't been publicly acknowledged and access that hadn't been openly earned. I felt the familiar instinct to pull back, to avoid drawing conclusions too quickly, but the alignment was too close to dismiss. Certain timelines mirrored internal schedules I knew existed. Certain assumptions matched conversations that were never meant to leave a corporate setting. I kept my face neutral, my posture relaxed, resisting the urge to react. Experience had taught me that the most dangerous mistakes happen when people reveal what they know too soon. So I listened. I let their words stack up without interruption, letting the weight of them settle before deciding what they meant. The bride's family spoke with the ease of people who had never been challenged on their authority, who believed outcomes bent naturally in their favor. That kind of certainty doesn't come from optimism. It comes from leverage. Still, I didn't reach for my phone or confront anyone. I didn't need confirmation yet. I needed clarity. As the conversation shifted and the noise of the reception swelled again, one thing was clear. Whatever position the bride's family thought they held, it rested on the assumption that no one in that room would question how they got there. For now, I let that assumption stand. Observing was enough. Acting could wait. It began as a gesture that looked harmless enough, a light touch on my arm, and a suggestion delivered with a practiced smile, the kind that signals politeness while quietly demanding compliance. The bride guided me away from the crowd without drawing attention, steering us toward a quieter corner of the venue where the music softened and conversations blurred into background noise. Her tone stayed pleasant, measured, as if this were a courtesy rather than a confrontation, and she spoke the way people do when they believe the outcome has already been decided. She talked about family as a system with natural hierarchies, about how some people carry responsibility, while others benefit from stability, about how not everyone needs to be involved in decisions to feel included. Every sentence was framed as reassurance, but the meaning beneath it was unmistakable. She was explaining my place, not asking for my understanding. She referenced my brother's future with confidence, spoke of plans moving forward, of expectations that no longer needed discussion, and when she mentioned me, it was as an afterthought, a variable already accounted for and resolved. There was no insult I could point to, nothing sharp enough to confront without appearing defensive, and that restraint was intentional. She wanted me quiet, grateful, aware of my position. I stayed silent, letting her continue, and the longer she spoke, the more comfortable she became. That comfort was her mistake. Somewhere between explaining how things worked and celebrating how well her family had positioned themselves, she let something slip. She mentioned an upcoming change tied to an agreement she described as settled, finalized, past the point of negotiation. The phrasing caught my attention immediately. It wasn't speculative language or hopeful projection. It was the kind of certainty that comes only after access has been granted and alignment confirmed. I recognized the structure of it, the way she referenced timing and approval, as if they were procedural steps already cleared, rather than obstacles to be addressed. I kept my expression neutral, my posture relaxed, even as my focus narrowed. She continued, clearly unaware that she had crossed a line, speaking with pride about how her family had anticipated resistance and positioned themselves ahead of it, how they had secured support where it mattered most. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that this confidence wasn't based on optimism or influence alone. It was built on the assumption that the system was already working in their favor. Pieces from earlier conversations snapped into place, the timelines I had overheard, the certainty that had seemed premature, the ease with which her family discussed matters that were never meant to leave internal rooms. This wasn't social bravado. It was operational. I felt the familiar weight of being underestimated press in the same dismissal I had known growing up, now layered with something far more serious. Her words diminished me personally, but what they revealed carried implications well beyond hurt feelings. I didn't interrupt. I didn't challenge her version of events or reveal that I understood more than she assumed. I let her finish, nodding once, offering nothing that might alert her to the shift that had already occurred. She concluded with a satisfied smile, clearly believing the conversation had reinforced boundaries rather than exposed vulnerabilities. When we rejoined the reception, the noise swallowed us again, laughter and music smoothing over the moment as if it had never happened. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, everything had. The personal slight faded into the background, eclipsed by the realization that her family's confidence rested on access they believed was secure and unquestioned. That belief carried risk not just for them, but for anyone connected to it. I didn't act on that understanding yet. I didn't confirm it aloud or allow it to show. For now, silence remained the most effective response, not because I lacked a voice, but because I had just learned exactly where it would matter most. Clarity came the moment I stepped far enough away from the celebration to think without interruption. I didn't leave the venue or draw attention to myself. I simply found a quiet corner and made a call that wasn't emotional or dramatic, just precise. I reached someone inside the company who understood that when I asked questions like this, I already had a reason. I didn't mention the wedding or the people involved. I asked for a standard verification framed as a routine internal check, the kind that happens quietly every day. The response came quickly and without confusion, which told me this wasn't an unusual request. We started with access records, then moved to benefit chains and authorization paths, reviewing how certain approvals had been granted and why they had moved faster than normal. At first glance, everything looked polished, almost too polished, like a system that had been touched just enough to appear compliant while doing something else underneath. As we dug deeper, the pattern emerged. The bride's family wasn't operating outside the system, they were operating through it, drawing advantages from channels they didn't own, but had learned to navigate. These weren't favors or accidents. They were consistent advantages that showed up in timing, priority, and insulation from scrutiny. Each instance alone could have been explained away as efficiency or good positioning, but together, they formed a clear sequence of benefit. Permissions had been stretched beyond their intended scope. Oversight checkpoints had been rerouted without triggering alerts. Decisions that should have required multiple independent reviews were passing through with minimal resistance. This wasn't ambition or confidence, it was misuse. I asked for documentation, only no opinions, no speculation, and what I received was clean, time-stamped, and internally consistent. The data didn't argue. It simply existed. That was when a third element entered the picture. Someone else separate from the bride's family had been affected earlier and recognized the same pressure points once they were described. This person had raised concerns in the past and been quietly sidelined, their objections dismissed as timing issues or strategic differences. Now placed alongside the broader pattern, their experience fit perfectly. They provided records that filled in what the internal logs couldn't show: how influence had been applied indirectly, how resistance had been neutralized without confrontation, how outcomes had been shaped without leaving fingerprints. With that addition, the structure became complete. The bride's family had positioned themselves to benefit from a system they assumed would protect them indefinitely. The confidence I had observed earlier suddenly made sense. It wasn't arrogance without basis. It was certainty built on access. I stayed focused on verification, refusing to let the personal context distort the assessment. This wasn't about being insulted or dismissed. It was about operational risk and responsibility. I requested one final cross-check through an independent internal control, and when that came back aligned with everything else, there was nothing left to question. The truth didn't need interpretation or framing. It stood on evidence alone. I ended the call without issuing instructions or reacting outwardly. No alarms were triggered. No immediate actions were taken. Understanding the full scope mattered more than moving too quickly. When I put the phone away and returned to the reception, nothing on the surface had changed. The music continued. Conversations flowed. Laughter filled the space. But my position within that room was no longer the same. What I carried wasn't power in a dramatic sense. It was certainty grounded in verified facts, and that certainty was far more dangerous than confrontation. I didn't look at anyone differently or signal awareness. The evening moved forward exactly as planned, unaware that suspicion had already been replaced by proof, and that every assumption made earlier now rested on solid ground rather than instinct. The moment arrived quietly, without ceremony, while the reception moved forward exactly as planned. Music carried across the venue, conversations, overlapped, glasses clinked, and no one sensed that anything was about to change. I stood slightly apart, not isolated, just unclaimed by any circle, and considered the two paths in front of me with the same calm I used in boardrooms. I could intervene. I knew precisely how. One discreet message could slow the internal review under a procedural excuse, something vague and respectable. A single authorization could keep a key sponsorship intact long enough for the wedding to remain untouched, for family appearances to stay smooth, for everyone to leave, believing the night had ended well. That option existed because I had earned the right to discretion. It would not have required explanation, justification, or confrontation, but it would have required me to place personal comfort above the system I had built and enforced for everyone else. I did not frame the decision as emotional or ethical. I stripped it down to function. The review that had begun was legitimate. It followed predefined triggers, not personal grievances. It existed because patterns had crossed thresholds that could not be ignored. Intervening would not erase those patterns, only delay their exposure. I took out my phone when no one was watching and opened a message that had been waiting, a routine confirmation sent automatically once the audit reached a certain stage. The language was neutral and procedural, asking whether the process should continue without exception. There was no space for commentary. I read it carefully, then selected the option that allowed it to proceed as designed. No notes, no conditions, no follow-up requests. The system acknowledged the confirmation and the review moved forward without my voice attached to it. That was the first decision. The second followed almost immediately, not as retaliation, but as alignment. One of the bride's family's advantages rested on an external backing arrangement that required periodic renewal. It was not guaranteed and had never been formally challenged because no one had questioned the legitimacy of how they operated within the system. I accessed the authorization panel and withdrew that backing under a standard policy rationale, something impersonal and clean. The interface accepted the change without friction. No alerts were triggered. No notifications were sent to the people affected. The impact would not be immediate, but it would be unavoidable. I closed the application and put my phone away. I did not tell my brother. I did not inform my parents. I did not look for the bride or her family. Silence was not hesitation, it was containment. Speaking would have turned the decision into a negotiation, and negotiation would have weakened the outcome. Around me, the reception continued uninterrupted. Laughter rose. Someone tapped a glass, signaling an upcoming toast. The assumption that everything was secure remained intact, and I allowed it to. I did not need anyone to understand what had changed in that moment. The processes now in motion did not depend on recognition or approval. They would unfold according to the same rules applied to anyone else who crossed those lines. I felt no satisfaction and no anger, only a steady clarity that I had not bent the structure to accommodate people who believed it existed for their benefit alone. Choosing not to speak was not an act of avoidance. It was the final step in removing myself from responsibility for outcomes I did not create. As the music swelled again and the evening pushed forward, I knew that the most decisive actions of the night had already taken place quietly without witnesses, and that nothing said aloud from this point on could change what had already been set in motion. What followed the wedding did not resemble revenge, and it did not look dramatic from the outside. It arrived the way consequences usually do in the real world, quietly through process and procedure rather than confrontation. Within a short time, the internal review advanced from routine verification into a formal investigation. Compliance teams followed established protocols, mapping approval trails, auditing access privileges, and documenting repeated deviations that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Each step was recorded, reviewed, and cross-checked. No one was singled out emotionally, and no accusations were made prematurely. The system simply did what it was designed to do once irregular patterns reached a defined threshold. As findings accumulated, actions followed in a predictable order. Individuals whose roles had relied on informal influence were placed on leave pending outcome. Others were removed once policy violations were confirmed beyond interpretation. Contracts tied to those individuals were suspended, then terminated when justifications failed independent review. These decisions were communicated through formal notices written in neutral language citing risk exposure and governance requirements. There were no announcements, no public explanations, and no room for negotiation. The bride's family felt the shift almost immediately, even before they understood its source. Meetings they expected to lead no longer included them. Emails that once received quick responses came back delayed or redirected. Partnerships they had treated as permanent were reclassified as conditional and then quietly dissolved. Their reputation did not collapse overnight, but it lost its foundation. In professional circles, confidence in their names softened into caution. Invitations slowed, Opportunities narrowed, and the assumption of credibility disappeared. They discovered that much of what they believed was secure had never truly belonged to them. Melissa's brother experienced a different kind of consequence, one that could not be documented in reports, but was no less real. The marriage did not insulate him from scrutiny. People began to ask careful questions, not accusatory, but probing. How involved had he been? What had he known? Why had certain details gone unexamined? Even without evidence of direct wrongdoing, association carried weight. In corporate environments, proximity can be enough to change how trust is extended. He found himself needing to explain choices he had never questioned before, facing professional hesitation, where there had once been automatic acceptance. At home, the impact unfolded more slowly. The family's assumptions unraveled as events forced clarity they had long avoided. Comfort had been built on silence, on accepting surface narratives without challenge. When those narratives collapsed, there was no easy replacement. Melissa was not confronted with anger or demands for explanation. Instead, she encountered uncertainty and distance, the quiet recalibration that happens when people realize they misunderstood someone who never corrected them. She did not clarify her role or outline the decisions she had made. By the time the consequences became visible, explanations would have served no purpose. The outcomes were already in motion, governed by rules that applied regardless of personal relationships. Professionally, the matter resolved cleanly. Risk was identified and removed. Oversight was reinforced. The system corrected itself without exception. Personally, the separation was complete. Melissa did not attend conversations meant to repair appearances or soften outcomes. She declined invitations framed as reconciliation or closure. The distance that followed was not emotional or hostile. It was structural. Life adjusted around the new reality. The bride's family reoriented themselves without the advantages they had assumed were permanent. Melissa's brother recalculated his future with a clearer understanding of the choices he had made. The family learned too late that exclusion has long-term cost. There was no sense of triumph in watching the process unfold. Only a recognition that accountability does not require confrontation to be final. It does not announce itself or justify its timing. It arrives through systems consequences and the quiet realization that some doors close not out of malice, but because they were never meant to stay open. The departure happened without tension or ceremony, just a quiet shift that felt overdue. I left Wisconsin early, before conversations could form and before anyone felt entitled to explanations. There was no confrontation waiting to happen, no scene to avoid, only the certainty that staying longer would have created expectations I had no intention of fulfilling. I packed what I needed, closed the door behind me, and moved through the familiar motions of leaving as if I were returning from any other obligation. At the airport, I did not replay the wedding or catalog what had gone wrong. I did not wonder who might be confused or offended by my absence. The need to be understood had already faded. I boarded the plane with the same calm I felt when making decisions that do not require consensus. As the city fell away beneath the clouds, I noticed something that surprised me. There was no emotional residue pulling me backward. No urge to check messages, no impulse to anticipate questions. That absence told me more than any conversation could have. Distance, when chosen deliberately, does not feel like escape. It feels like clarity. Once I was home, life resumed without adjustment. Meetings filled my calendar. Decisions required attention. Systems continued to run as they always had. Nothing in my world needed to be rearranged to accommodate what had happened. The wedding had not disrupted my life. It had simply confirmed how separate my life already was. I did not announce boundaries or issue final statements. I did not block calls or dramatize silence. I stopped initiating contact and allowed unanswered messages to remain unanswered. Invitations arrived and passed without response. Emotional access closed the same way professional access does not, with a declaration, but with consistency. Over time, the pattern spoke for itself. I did not seek recognition for what I had built, or acknowledgement for what I had endured. Those things lose meaning once you stop asking for them. I understood that my absence would be interpreted in different ways. Some would see it as indifference, others would call it pride or distance. A few might frame it as punishment. None of those interpretations required correction. When people are accustomed to narratives that exclude you, they will create new ones when you step out of view. I did not feel the need to guide that process. I also did not feel anger toward my family. Anger implies attachment, and attachment was no longer there. What remained was neutrality, steady and unforced. I did not wish them harm, nor did I wish to repair what had never been mutual. I accepted that the relationship existed in a form that no longer aligned with who I was. That acceptance did not feel heavy. It felt precise. Weeks passed, and the distance held without effort. There were no dramatic attempts at reconciliation, no late-night messages demanding clarity. Perhaps the silence answered more questions than words ever could. I did not revisit the events in my mind or imagine alternative endings. What had happened followed a logical sequence shaped by choices that were not mine alone. I did not carry responsibility for outcomes I had not engineered, only for the boundaries I maintained afterward. My life continued forward without referencing the wedding as a turning point. It was not an ending that required emphasis. It was simply a moment that clarified what was already true. I had built a life that did not depend on proximity to people who overlooked me, and I no longer needed to prove that life existed. Cutting emotional ties did not feel like loss. It felt like alignment with reality. Some chapters do not close with reconciliation or understanding. They close when you stop returning to them for answers. I did not leave with resentment or regret, only with the quiet assurance that I was no longer available to be misunderstood. The story did not end in confrontation or resolution. It ended in continuity, a life moving forward, unchanged, steady, and self-directed, without the need to explain why certain doors remain closed once you realize they were never meant to be reopened. Thank you all for taking the time to watch the video. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos.